And welcome back to a special edition of Hannity. Tonight, we are taking a close look at media bias. Now, the scandal that erupted over an article leaking the identity of CIA employee Valerie Plame became so big it threatened to take down the Bush administration. Now, what most people don't know is what much of the controversy was created, well, by the media itself.
Mr. Speaker, the President of the United States.
The British government has learned that Saddam Hussein recently sought significant quantities of uranium from Africa.
Those 16 words sparked a political firestorm, and thanks to the mainstream media, they also sparked what became known as the Plame scandal, in which the media sacrificed principle at the altar of politics and exposed their blind hatred for the Bush administration.
A president who lied us into a war and
there are still far more questions than there are answers.
It began with the New York Times op-ed authored by the left-wing diplomat Joseph Wilson, who had been sent to Niger on an intelligence gathering mission in 2002. Now, Wilson claimed that the president's statement was false and charged that the Bush administration had manipulated intelligence in order to launch the Iraq war.
When one comes back from an intelligence gathering trip, if one goes to a news media and starts writing partisan political editorials, that's not just strange, it's outrageous.
Mr. Wilson had been in the National Security Office of the Clinton administration. He was known around Washington as being someone of clear political views on the left side of the spectrum. I think they should have asked some questions which might have led them to some of his political connections.
Instead of asking these questions, the media energetically peddled Wilson's story about the administration's, quote, alleged lies.
Anyone who's going to turn on the Bush administration is going to get starch treatment.
The mainstream media was so inclined to believe Wilson that they ignored a bipartisan Senate intelligence report that exposed his lies. Former Senator Kip Bond served on that committee and helped craft that report.
The report that Joe Wilson made at the time seemed to indicate that Iraq was looking for uranium from Niger.
I think a lot of reporters just didn't want to consider the idea that Wilson had actually gone to Niger and essentially found that there had been an earlier attempt by Iraq to purchase yellowcake uranium, which would have undercut the entire story that Bush lied in the famous 16-word statement in the State of the Union address.
And the media didn't stop there. When journalist Robert Novak wrote a column noting that Wilson's wife, Valerie Plame, was an undercover CIA agent, the media cited the column as evidence of a smear campaign against Wilson and his family, organized, of course, by the Bush White House.
He is the victim of a Bush administration smear campaign.
One former U.S. diplomat is tonight saying he is getting smeared, in effect, by the White House.
Wilson says his family is the subject of a smear campaign by senior administration officials.
But once again, the mainstream media chose fiction over fact and politics over principle.
Valerie Plame was not covert because she didn't come under the law's definition of a covert officer.
I can remember appearing on television and simply saying flatly, I know there's no underlying crime here. There's no underlying crime because Valerie Plame does not qualify as a covert CIA agent under the law that you're discussing.
Regardless of the facts, the media clamored for an investigation.
The media, all the way from the Atlantic Constitution to the Washington Post, and in between in the alphabet, the Boston Globe, the New York Times, were all crying out for an investigation.
The media came out and they started doing story after story after story, demanding to know who it was that was his source.
Now, according to Plame, Wilson, and the mainstream media, the source of the alleged leak was located somewhere in the Bush White House.
What did the president know, and when did he know it? What did he know about his top hardballer, Karl Rove's role in the CIA leak affair?
What should Karl Rove do if he is indicted?
For the liberal media, an indictment of White House operatives would have been Christmas come early.
I love to see those kinds of things happen. It does wonders for me.
And they got their wish when Special Prosecutor Patrick Fitzgerald was appointed to investigate the Plame scandal.
There were some on the left who viewed the day that Fitzgerald would reveal his indictments. They viewed that as Fitzmas because they saw a whole number of Bush officials being indicted and ultimately sent to jail on this.
Now, the tragic outcome of the media's rush to judgment was that innocent men inside the White House took the blame. Now, one in particular, Cheney's chief of staff, Scooter Libby, was indicted and later convicted of perjury in 2007. Now, this conviction occurred even after it became clear in the fall of 2006 that State Department official Richard Armitage, no right-winger, was the source of this leak.
When we finally learned that the main source for the Valerie Plame information was Richard Armitage, the reaction was, oh, never mind. It's an inconvenient fact that you try to sweep under the rug rather than confront and realize that, frankly, you've been had.
Now, this stands in stark contrast to the media's treatment of Wilson and Plame.
Joe Wilson and Valerie Plame Wilson became celebrities. They became heroes. They were featured in glossy layouts in Vanity Fair, and they ultimately had a very positive Hollywood movie made about them.
Given the cursory level of investigation conducted by the media, the real question becomes whether they were duped by Wilson and Plame or actually complicit in the scandal.
The media were duped by Joe Wilson and Valerie Plame. It was only because the media wanted to be duped by those two people.
Now, regardless of the answer, it was the American people and the truth who were the casualties of this media scandal.
Plame scandal was Washington at its worst. It was the media out of control, relentlessly pursuing a story in scorched earth fashion.
The amount of effort and attention paid to it detracted from legitimate coverage, both positive and negative, that could have been given to the war and the issues surrounding it.
I think America deserved more than that.
And coming up, it touts itself as being all the news that is fit to print. Well, coming up next, we uncover how the New York Times has a very tricky way of defining what is and is not news. And welcome back to the special edition of Hannity. Now, the New York Times is often called the paper of record, but we've uncovered that, well, it's not living up to its reputation.
The New York Times has a long-held slogan of all the news that's fit to print, but I think that astute readers over the years understand that their operational motto is all the news that's fit to distort, all the news that's fit to suppress, and all the news that's fit to ignore.
As the New York Times, long revered as the gold standard in print journalism, lost its lofty position as a result of bias.
I'm a centrist Democrat, and I have always believed that the New York Times is the paper of record. That being said, I now see that the New York Times has become a newspaper with a point of view, and that point of view is on the left.
It's the story that consults an expert, and the expert is at a left-leaning think tank. It's the story that consults an expert, and the expert is a left-leaning professor somewhere. It's those kind of things that make the news stories lean just a bit to the left.
Some say the shift can be traced back 10 years to when Hal Raines went from being the left-leaning editorial page editor to executive editor of the paper itself. Now, Raines, who admitted in his memoir to always voting as a liberal, wrote that the religious climate of the late 90s was, quote, mutating into the new redneck church militant that would, in a few months, deliver us into the land of W, where the monkey trial gives way to the monkey grin. In 2003, Raines resigned in the wake of the Jason Blair scandal just 2 years into his post as executive editor. As many remember, Jason Blair was fired from the Times for making up facts and stories.
I'm truly sorry for my actions and what they've done.
William McGowan is a columnist who first began examining journalistic bias in his book called Coloring the News. His latest book, Gray Lady Down, looks at the New York Times.
I thought it was important to look at what was going on inside America's premier news organization. And it was frightening. The blunders, the biased coverage, the gaffes are kind of chilling.
Now, there are several major news stories that illustrate the pervasive liberal bias at the New York Times. One of the most glaring examples involves the 3 Duke lacrosse players who in 2006 were falsely accused of rape by an exotic dancer. Now, the New York Times was quick to jump on the story, but not on the facts.
They smeared those players, they jumped to conclusions.
Articles and op-eds were written titled, "When Peer Pressure, Not a Conscience, is Your Guide. A Team's Troubles Shock Few at Duke, and When Boys Go Wild."
They fell into the role of assassinating the character of the Duke lacrosse students and somehow cloaking this dancer in the mantle of victimhood.
Charges were dropped against the men in April of the following year when it was revealed that the accuser had made up the entire story.
There were many points in this case where caution would have served justice better than bravado.
But their reputations were already tarnished.
It's been 395 days since this nightmare began.
These guys had their lives upended for a year or more, and there was no post-mortem where they should have tasked a couple of reporters to say, Duke rape case, how we messed up.
More recently, the Times coverage of the Tea Party protests across the country has been called into question.
They have failed to acknowledge that the Tea Party is a large, legitimate, grassroots organization. Having written a book about the Tea Party, I know that the Tea Party I wrote about is a very different Tea Party than the one the New York Times has described.
What we had was an almost coordinated effort by every single columnist on the New York Times op-ed page to take any last act of random violence or random discord and blame it on the Tea Party.
This same liberal slant was noticeable last year when Arizona passed its strict anti-illegal immigration law.
When that law passed, you really would have thought it was something akin to Hitler's Nuremberg laws.
And when Arizona Congresswoman Gabrielle Giffords was shot by a deranged man earlier this year, the New York Times rushed to judgment once again. Within hours of the tragic shooting, Paul Krugman wrote on his blog, quote, "We don't have proof yet that this was political, but the odds are that it was. She's been the target of violence before. Her father says that the whole Tea Party was her enemy. And yes, she was on Sarah Palin's infamous crosshairs list."
In 2007, Bill Keller, who was the editor, insisted that the paper had no political or ideological agenda, that they simply reported the facts. But that wasn't the case in the aftermath of the Tucson massacre, certainly when you had the likes of Paul Krugman, Frank Rich, every hired and paid New York Times columnist trying to link those acts of violence that were committed by a single lone deranged individual and using it to try and undermine the free speech of conservatives. Their explicit, overt agenda was to try and chill conservative thought and criminalize conservative speech.
The New York Times lost its journalistic mind. It went from being an unquestioned left-of-center newspaper to a radical left-wing newspaper. And it might as well be produced by the Obama administration.
And coming up, so what do Governor Palin, President Bush, Senator McCain, and Juan Williams all have in common? We take a closer look at all of those who have been victimized by the venom of the mainstream media's liberal bias. That and much more next. And welcome back to the special edition of Hannity Behind the Bias. Now, based on all the evidence that you have seen so far, not many would dare to dispute the existence of a liberal bias in today's so-called mainstream media. But perhaps no one is more acutely aware of this and that bias than those who have been adversely affected by it.
If ever there was a media victim, it was George W. Bush.
I watched how the media would twist words of his, how they would conveniently forget facts, how context was not included, and sometimes you would have very disgusted tones.
This disgust carried over into the way President Bush was portrayed by the media as someone who, because of his conservative views and laid-back Southern drawl, clearly lacked a certain level of intelligence.
Well, Mr. President, for one, you whisper too loud.
Yeah, it's always been a problem of mine. That is one of the many reasons that I am no friend to libraries.
They satirize every president, but the venom with which they did this about George Bush, and so continually, that told us everything.
They believe President Obama is smarter than President Bush. I don't think that's true, but the caricature develops of any politician, and it sticks.
Just consider, by comparison, the critical coverage, or lack thereof, of our current president. Even anchors at liberal MSNBC cannot help but notice the double standard.
The president doing his brackets yesterday and then going to a fundraiser. Would we be more critical if this was George W. Bush?
I just shake my head and think, President Bush never could have said that and gotten away with a story on page A17.
But the bias didn't end with the Bush presidency. In fact, the 2008 election arguably gave the mainstream media an excuse to victimize more conservatives than ever before.
John McCain was, of course, a great target. It wasn't that they hated McCain. He was a very popular figure with the media until the election came, and he was pitted against Barack Obama. Here was this great, eloquent spokesman for the left, and here was McCain.
Ahmadinejad. I sort of giggled a little bit when I saw John McCain stumble over Ahmadinejad's name.
It was as childish a reaction, but it was an instinctive reaction. The instinctive reaction was to get McCain.
In the heat of the campaign, the Times published an article alleging an affair between Senator McCain and a lobbyist based solely on anonymous sources. Now, the lobbyist later filed a multi-million-dollar defamation lawsuit against the paper, and while reportedly no money was awarded, the Times did follow up by printing an uncommon, quote, note to readers, which stated that it had not intended to conclude any affair took place.
For this, they took a hit. But all of this was made possible, and he was essentially lost in that media bias.
Meanwhile, John McCain wasn't the only victim of the 2008 election.
There's probably no one more famous for being the target of liberal media bias than Sarah Palin.
You didn't say to yourself, am I experienced enough? Am I ready?
I didn't hesitate, no.
Doesn't that take some hubris?
Charlie Gibson was probably the worst moment interviewing Sarah Palin, because he actually managed to look like an ancient professor looking down his glasses at her. Television doesn't lie. Those looks, those moments of condescension, the raised eyebrow, the kind of self-satisfied, smug smile.
The assaults against the former Alaska governor and Fox News contributor got especially ugly when the press decided to focus on her family.
Andrew Sullivan maniacally went after Sarah Palin, and he calculated that she couldn't be Trigg's mother, and all of this with a kind of innocent search, and nobody went after him.
It can't be easy for her to see attacks on her family, which everybody then will say that should be off limits, but then they go and do it again. And she has never responded in kind. She has argued on the merits, and I think that's what continues to drive people crazy.
More recently, another one of our colleagues here at the Fox News Channel was unfairly singled out by the liberal mainstream media.
It starts with Bill O'Reilly saying Muslims attacked us on 9/11, Muslims killed us, which then prompted people on The View to run off the set in alarm at what O'Reilly had said. Then O'Reilly, in a subsequent show, says to me,
so where am I going wrong there, Juan?
When I get on a plane, I got to tell you, if I see people who are in Muslim garb, and I think, they're identifying themselves first and foremost as Muslims, I get worried, I get nervous. It was the left wing. And it was NPR who not only said that I was a racist and a bigot, but that I had crossed a line of journalistic ethics by simply saying how I felt.
2 days later, the company fired Juan Williams.
He disgraced them in their little inner world view of what they're supposed to represent. A face and a voice that appears on NPR was out there saying things sympathetic to conservatives.
It comes back to, I work for Fox News. I am not predictably in my political sentiments one way or the other. NPR leadership was imposing then on the journalist a mindset that was distorted and as corrupt as any operating in journalism today.
Regrettably, the corruption is now so widespread, it has succeeded in permeating every area of the mainstream media. And while we may have focused on just a few here, the names could go on and on and on.
If you stop and review these items, the kind of media bias in this country, then you can see how pernicious it is and how extensive and cancerous it can be. And I sit here as a victim of it.
And that is all the time we have left this evening. Thank you for being with us, and I hope you have a great night.